Welcome to Grace Fellowship Baptist Church Wednesday evening Bible study for Wednesday, January 25th, 2023. We are in the book of 2 Samuel, first chapter, and verse 17. Let's start there. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan in order that the men of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jasher. Now, this is the introduction to this poem that David has composed grieving for Jonathan and Saul. David was still loyal to King Saul even after his death. This tells us his heart. He is loyal to the country. He is loyal to its leadership. He is loyal to the people that God put in charge. Even though Saul was jealous of him, afraid of him, and hunting him down, David was still loyal. He understood that the death of a king was grievous, even if it did mean that he got promoted. He was not seeking the kingship. He knew God would give it to him at the right time. He was also very bonded with Jonathan. Jonathan was his pal. In one sense, they were as close as battle buddies, even though they never fought together directly. They were competing generals, so to speak, in the army, each of them doing their task that was assigned them by the king. Saul, though, was trying to promote Jonathan, and in the process, minimize David. God, of course, had other plans. The phrase, the lament of the bow, it is a idiomatic expression in Hebrew. It is a kind of poetry that deals with people dying in battle. And this is one of the copies we have of A Lament of the Bow. And it's written about Jonathan and Saul, and we'll get into it in just a minute. The other thing I'm going to note is it's recorded in the book of Jasher. The book of Jasher was apparently a book being written contemporaneous with David in his times, and the authors of Samuel took it as source material to make sure that they had things right. Now, they could have walked around to different villages in Judah and asked the people that had memorized this lament to quote it to them, and then gone to another village and had them quote it and to make sure they had it right. But because it was written in the book of Jasher, and apparently he recorded it correctly by either recording it directly from David or somebody memorized it from him, or compared multiple sources in different villages where it was memorized to make sure he got it right. So we know this is David's words, the way he recorded it. And it is, the book of Jasher is lost to us. This is not the only reference there is to it in Scripture. Several different places in Samuel, Kings, and I think even Chronicles, it is mentioned. So it's a source material that they used to help them write the Scripture. And it was apparently a historical account, semi-chronological. It does contain poetry like this, and stories and things like that. And so it was something they had written down at the time. We don't know why it didn't survive till this day. It would be interesting to get a hold of a copy of it and see what it did contain, but we don't. And it's been long enough since it was written. It having been kept would be a very great thing. Apparently, up to the Babylonian captivity, there were copies of it around. Apparently, the Babylonian captivity, it was one of the things lost. It may have had some copies that survived the Babylonian captivity that then got lost with time. After that, we don't know. But it was a source material they had. Let's get to verse 19. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ascalon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. O mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain, nor fields that yield offerings of grain. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life they were loved and gracious, and in death they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles, they were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned your garments with ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You are very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. It's not actually all that long, and particularly as poems of that era go. There are, from that same kind of time period, epic poems that go on for thousands of lines. This didn't take all that long to read, even in English. But there's a lot packed into it. He starts off with his big complaint. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights. And who would be the glory of Israel? Well, obviously God, but God is not slain, and David is not saying that. It's king and its political leadership, which would be Jonathan and his brothers and a lot of the men with them. That was the core of the government. In a monarchy, the family is the government. And in this case, it was Saul and Jonathan and his brothers and their closest kin and advisors who would have all been fighting together in a group. And they're lying slain. They died in battle, and this is a grievous thing. And they were mighty men. They were good warriors, and they were the core of the country in one sense. And then he starts doing some beautiful poetry. You know, he says, tell it not in Gath. In other words, don't let the enemy gloat. Don't let them know. Now, they do know. He knows they know. He knows that they controlled the battlefield and they were present and they knew that Saul was dead. But he's telling them, don't gloat over it. Don't brag about it. Don't tell it. And he's mentioning two different cities in Philistia. And he's doing that as a couplet. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ascalon. In Hebrew, almost equal number of syllables in both of those, and it's a couplet. It's essentially the same information twice, but that's Hebrew poetry. And then, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, and the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Again, a couplet. It's essentially the same information repeated in two different ways. He doesn't want the Philistines, their people that don't worship Yahweh, rejoicing in Saul's death. Yes, they would have been glad they won the battle. They would have been glad they killed the king, but they shouldn't rejoice. Anybody who opposes God should not rejoice when they appear to have a victory over God's people, or God's point of people. It's not a time of rejoicing when evil wins. And he actually does that as a couple of couplets, telling it, don't tell it in the cities, don't let the people rejoice. So again, the same idea is told twice. Each telling is in a couplet. And this is kind of typical of Hebrew poetry. Part of the reason they did that is Hebrew, the endings of the words, they're inflected with the construction of language. So if you're, you know, in second person plural, all the words in that sentence would be in second person plural, and the endings would be the same. So naturally, Hebrew rhymes. You can't avoid it rhyming. If you don't have it rhymed, you would find it weird, like saying, you know, instead of I am, I are. If as an English speaker I said I are, everybody would be like, what's wrong with Frank? If we said we is, you'd go like, what's wrong? Well, you're not using English right. So properly used Hebrew is going to naturally rhyme. Making poems that rhyme in Hebrew is trivial. In fact, spoken Hebrew is going to rhyme. Every word in a phrase, a clause, is going to rhyme. All you have to do to make the next line rhyme is use the same tense. Doesn't help you remember the words because it's just natural to the language. So they used couplets, the same idea repeated in different forms. Now, that is actually much harder in Hebrew than it seems. English has come from a bunch of different root languages. We have a bunch of different words that mean almost the same thing or identical things and may have some slight different connotations, but we have words that mean the same thing, and so it's easy to say the same thing in a different set of words. There are things in Hebrew, there's only one way to say them. There's only one set of words that will express that idea. And if you're going to express that idea, you will say it this way. So getting ideas that say the same thing in couplets is actually a challenge. And getting it so that it flows smoothly is an even bigger challenge. And David has done that here. And he's done a couple of couplets, and that is actually even a bigger challenge. So it shows his poetic nature and his ability and his grasp of language and ability to state things well. And then he goes down to from proclaiming don't brag about Saul's death to talking about where they died. They're in Gilboa. And, you know, he's saying the mountains of Gilboa. Mount Gilboa was the big mountain in that region, and the region was consequently known as Gilboa. And so he's saying all those hills and Mount Gilboa, that heights area there. To mourn for the death of the king that happened on you, that you didn't protect your king. He's telling the physical features of the ground, the hills and stuff, that they should not have dew or rain, and that's a couplet, that they shouldn't grow crops. Because the mighty were killed there, and they drank the blood of the mighty. And the shield of the mighty was defied. That would have been, Jonathan and Saul, and the shield of Saul is no longer rubbed with oil. Well, the shields they had, they did not have iron. They had, largely their shields were leather. And to preserve the leather, you had to rub them with oil fairly routinely to keep them so they didn't absorb moisture and get soft, so they stayed hard and were protective. They were sometimes on a frame of wood. The king would probably had one that had a frame of brass or bronze because it was stronger, it was more capable. If he had really well, he might coat the leather with bronze or brass, but even there, bronze or brass would discolor with dirt or whatever, and you would rub it with oil to brighten it, to make it shiny, so that it well, it looks good, but that's not the main purpose. The main purpose was to make the metal slick, so when a weapon hit it, it slid off instead of biting in. Because bronze and brass are actually fairly soft metals, and if you hit them with the weapon right, you could cut into it and get some control of the shield. And so you rubbed them with oil so they were slick on the outside, and this helped preserve the color, preserve the finish. It also made it so it reflected light. And in certain circumstances, this could temporarily blind the enemy. It could startle them, distract them. It had all kinds of uses for that kind of thing. And obviously, a dead man does not oil his shield. He can't. And that's the point. Is Saul is no longer oiling his shield. And oiling the shield was done essentially daily in battle. You might, when you stored it, leave it up, not oiled for weeks or months at a time, but when it came time to start to prepare to go to war, you took it down and you oiled it. And once you left the house and went to battle, you oiled it every day because you never knew when you'd need it. And when you were in battle and you survived the battle that day, one of the things you did, yeah, you sharpened your sword, but you also oiled your shield. It's part of the daily prep. And Saul is no longer doing that. He's no longer capable of doing that. And that's a sad statement for any warrior. You're no longer able to do your job as a warrior, to keep prepared. And from the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, they died in battle there on the mountain, and the mountain drank their blood. And the mountain will consume their flesh. It will rot on the mountain. And he's talking there about Saul and Jonathan, even though their bodies were taken off the battlefield by the Philistines. He may have known that, he may not have known that at the point he wrote this. But the other mighty men that died in battle, like Saul's shield bearer, armor bearer, died, and they were left there. And, their bones are going to be on that mountainside and left there until they decompose, unless somebody cares enough to go out to the battlefield, find them, take them back, and bury them. And he's mourning that the mighty men of Israel have died in battle, and the slain were valiant. And then he starts telling how valiant they were. The bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. They fought to the end. They continued to fight until they could not fight anymore. And apparently Jonathan was well known for his use of the bow. We do know that when he was practicing warfare, he shot the bow. We have that story of him taking his boy servant out there with him and shooting him in the field, and then shooting the arrows in practice and having the boy retrieve them, take my stuff back to town, and then he met with David. We've gone through that one. We have no accounts of him using any other weapon. It would have been unusual if he didn't have a sword, but apparently he was a good archer, and his primary weapon was bow and arrow. And David knows that. He knows he's good with it, and he laments that he's no longer able to use it, and that he continued to fight as long as he was able. And the sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. He is confident that Saul continued to fight with his sword. We do know that Saul fought with the sword. We have several mentions of that. And that he would have fought till the end. David does not know at this point in time how he died, and or if he does, it's not important to him that he fell on his own sword, but that he committed suicide. He's lamenting that Saul stayed in battle and was brave and did not stop and run, but indeed stayed on the battlefield like a warrior should. He's pointing out that Saul and Jonathan were brave men who, even though the tide was turning against them, did not abandon their post. They're not cowards. They're strong-hearted. And they continued to fight to the end. And that's his point. They were courageous. They did their job as warriors. The battle overwhelmed them. They died. That's grievous. But they're not ashamed. And he is pointing that out. And then he turns in verse 23 that Saul and Jonathan loved each other in life and they were together in death. Beautiful, beautiful Hebrew poetry there. And that they were loved by their country and they were loved by their warriors and they died in that love. They loved the country enough, they were willing to give their life for it. And it's a lot packed into that couplet. So beautiful, so structured. David took time to make the language ring to say these things. It takes a whole lot longer to unpack it in English, or even in Hebrew, than it did to say it how he said it. Now, I'm sure it took some time to compose it and get it right. And he took that time. He took that effort. And, they were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Eagles were the fastest thing they could conceive of. It was a picture of being able to be fast. An eagle flying is very fast. And when they snatch prey, very often they don't even know what hit them. They're just dead. They were, the rabbit was nibbling grass and then suddenly he's dead and in the talons of the eagle. Doesn't even know what hit him. The lions were viewed as the strong predator. Yeah, bears are actually technically stronger, but bears in that part of the country, in that part of the world, did not hunt all that much. They ate carrion, they ate small game, but they didn't hunt big game. You still didn't want to poke a bear. It'd be a bad idea because it would defend itself. But lions were predators that hunted big game, and they hunted game that was bigger than them. And they were viewed as the strong. And that's strong in the sense not of physical strength so much as strength to commit to a hunt. If a 80-pound lion could take down a several 100-pound wildebeest or several 100-pound ox, that was viewed as strength. You were defeating something bigger than you, and the lions were known for that. And he says they're swifter than eagles, stronger than lions. That they were, swiftness and strength were two of the main characteristics you needed in hand-to-hand combat. Be faster than your enemy and be stronger than your enemy. And stronger in the sense of able to do more damage quicker. And if you needed to run, be able to run away faster. Bravery was the other one, and he dealt with that in the couplet right before that. And so he's now dealing with their physical prowess in battle. And they had good physical prowess in battle, he's saying. And then he turns in verse 24 he started with, the Philistines and how they should react and what they shouldn't do. He's now talked about their characteristics and about the characteristics of the battlefield. And now he's turning to Israel and how they should weep that their king is dead, that they should not rejoice in it. Yeah, David's going to get to be king. He's been anointed by Samuel. He knows that he's going to get to be king. And he knows God is taking care of Saul and made it so that he can ascend to the throne. But he's telling people, mourn for Saul, mourn that your king is dead. It's a grievous thing when the king dies. And he is very concerned for them. And the country does it right. He talks about how Saul made the country prosperous, that you are able to clothe your daughters and your wives with rich clothes and raiment, that your garments, were scarlet and finery, that you had gold ornaments, and all those things that indicate you had wealth. You were able to do that because Saul was your king and he kept the country safe. And mourn because that's no longer true. He made you prosperous and he's not here. So you need to be mourning. And then he starts back in about the army being killed. The mighty fall in battle. Jonathan lies slain on the ground. He's mourning for Jonathan himself. He was dearly bonded to him. You're very dear to me. Your love was more wonderful than that of women. David was a man that was clearly man. He enjoyed women. He had, at this point in time, had 3 wives. He had 2 of them with him, and he's going to gain other wives. It's not that he wasn't a woman kind of man. He was definitely a woman kind of man. And he's not saying that he had any kind of sexual attraction to Jonathan. That's not that. It's that he was more bonded to Jonathan than he is to his wives. Which is kind of mind-boggling to me. I don't have any bond deeper than I have with Frankie. She is my strongest bond. I have a deep bond with my mother. I have a deep bond with my dad. But Frankie and I have become more bonded than I ever was to them. As Scripture says, you leave your father and your mother and you cleave to your wife. That has happened with me. And I know the strength of that bond. And his bond with Jonathan was stronger than that. It had to be from God for it to be that strong. It's not natural for it to happen that way. And I've heard of battle buddies that fought back to back and they experienced great stress together being that kind of bonding. But Jonathan and he weren't battle buddies. They had their own groups of men that fought separately and they didn't fight back to back. They didn't have stress in battle together. They were independent players on the battlefield, so to speak. And at this point in time, David is probably very glad the Philistine leaders rejected him and sent him back, because if Saul and Jonathan were going to die in battle, he didn't need to be on the enemy side. He's seeing God's hand, that he wasn't involved. It's not his fault. Just like Nabal, the case with Nabal, that he did not take revenge for himself. He did not do anything that would cause Saul's and Jonathan's death. And they were very dear to him. And he loved Jonathan. Jonathan loved him, and he knew that. And he's pointing that out. And he's mourning that the mighty men of Israel, Saul, Jonathan, the other warriors also, not just the leadership that he's most bonded to, but the country has lost a lot of warriors, and that they ran in battle and they were defeated. and the mighty men have fallen. And he calls them weapons because he understands that in hand-to-hand combat, the human body is itself a weapon. And he's used it in battle, and he's used it effectively in battle. And here he is mourning they died, and the country is without these mighty men. It's a beautiful, stirring piece of poem, and when you look at it as a whole, as he goes through it in this reasonable progression of don't rejoice in Philistia. The mountains should mourn because they allowed it to happen. How powerful Jonathan and Saul were. How other people have died. How Israel should mourn that they've lost important people. And then how he has personally lost because Jonathan was such a dear friend to him. And that men that he held dear that had fought by his side, not battle buddies per se, but fought with him, had fallen in battle. And he's grieved. He knows these people. And he wants everybody to be grieved like he is. May we be that kind of bonded together as a church, that we would grieve each other's pains, whatever they are. And if grievous things happen, we would grieve them because it is harmful to us to see the other hurt. Gracious Lord, the love that David had for his country, for his king, for Jonathan, it's impressive. And Lord, have us be that kind of loyalty to each other, to you, that we would be people who build each other up, even in death. Lord, thank you that you made him a man after your own heart, that he could be the king you wanted him to be, and that people in that time would know that they would know that David did not rejoice at Saul's death, but indeed grieved, and that was grieved that Saul didn't die in his sleep of old age, but David would become king. Lord, you were working to bring David to the kingship at the right moment in time. And we are going to continue to study his story. But thank you for having recorded it. Thank you for men like Jasher that recorded it quickly and were able to preserve it so that when the authors of Samuel got around to it, they had the exact wording. This beautiful poem. We thank you for David's bright mind and love of language, that he could make this beautiful poem to lament the death and battle. In your holy name, amen. I am Frank Reich, Associate Pastor at Family Ministry at Grace Fellowship Baptist Church. I've been your host, and I hope to see you Wednesday night at the Bible study. If not, I hope to see you Sunday. Oscar has had some wonderful sermons. The sermon this morning was excellent. If you haven't been listening to him, I urge you go out and listen to his sermon series. And he's making some great points. He's saying some great things. You miss some good stuff if you don't listen. I'd prefer to see you in person on Sunday and on Wednesday. But if not, I'll see you here on YouTube. Have a blessed week.